In all the years I've been working in the Triangle, I've been very upfront about one thing. I'm just not that into recruiting. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that recruiting is very important to the story of Triangle sports. We already covered the 70s, the Big Four tournament, and the recruitment of David Thompson. But the 80s were just as crucial. Mike Krzyzewski shows up at Duke. You've got the class that saves Coach K. It builds towards back-to-back national championships. Dean Smith, who had enjoyed recruiting advantages, started to feel the heat, which gets us to the 90s and a very important class of his own.
UNC's Dean Smith likes to play a little golf in the summertime, but his mind won't stray too far from basketball. As for the much-talked-about freshman class with 7-foot Eric Montross here, the coach says you can't go by predictions.
I wish we were playing freshman teams next year. Then we'd have a better chance. You just can't tell.
This freshman class, returning veterans headed by Rick Fox here, plus Carolina's tradition should give Dean Smith a lot to look forward to. Meanwhile, he can enjoy his golf. In Chapel Hill, Bob Holliday, WRL TV5 Sports.
The so-called experts say Eric Montross can step right in. But even Eric isn't so sure.
For one person to be able to step in and make that kind of contribution, I don't think is possible right off the bat.
The big guy from Indiana will wear 00 for the Tar Heels, and his coach says there's a reason.
I guess his real hero was me in the junior high, because I had 00, and I got to find that picture to show him.
But it's this picture that has the fans drooling and the opposition dreading, the 90-91 Tar Heels. In Chapel Hill, Jay Jennings, WRAL TV5 Sports.
ACC recruiting coverage today is rather mainstream. Your favorite team probably has 3 to 4 different websites devoted to the topic. But it wasn't like that back in the day, and there was one trailblazer that saw where this was going.
The Triangle has the most unique landscape for sports. 3 major universities along Tobacco Road with rabid fan bases, a Stanley Cup champion, an NFL team right down the road, and heavily invested transplants. Not to mention an interesting mix of sports teams that were. Joe Ovies brings you a brief history of Triangle sports, a candid conversation with those who help shape why sports matters here.
David Glenn is the former editor of the ACC Sports Journal. In a time frame that covers well over 30 years, he took it from a newsletter to an information-packed newspaper, and like everything else in this business, moved the Sports Journal to online platforms, while retaining a love for print, thanks to a glossy magazine. In addition to the ACC Sports Journal, David Glenn also hosted a regionally syndicated sports talk show for over 10 years. It's in radio where I first met Glenn and got my introduction to the insane world of recruiting. In fact, recruiting is a big reason why sports coverage today is the way that it is. And I can't think of anyone better equipped than David Glenn to help explain how we got here. So how does a guy who grew up in Philly, went to college in South Florida, ends up in law school, practicing attorney, end up in the Triangle covering ACC sports? Come on, Dave, help me, man. Help me.
Yeah, it is hard to piece that puzzle together, Joe. The reality was I graduated from UNC Law School in 1994, and whereas most of my law school colleagues had done clerkships for judges and other legal-oriented jobs in the summers between our semesters, I had been doing sports media stuff, as I had done going all the way back to undergrad. So I worked a little bit for Raycom, doing projects for them in the summer. I worked for the Durham Herald-Sun newspaper, and I worked for what was then known as the Poop Sheet, just as a freelance writer, contributor. And because it was based in Chapel Hill and I was living in Chapel Hill, I was also an editor for them, just on a freelance part-time basis. So I started practicing law in 1994. The longtime editor of the Poop Sheet, a guy named Thad Mumal, had decided to kind of move on to the next chapter of his career. So I was asked by the owners, do you want to be the editor? And I said yes and no. And the yes part was I really did, if the fit was right, prefer to work in sports media. Although I liked the law, I liked sports media even more. and I had a lot of experience in it at that point. The no part was, I'm not calling Dean Smith or Mike Krzyzewski and leaving a message saying, this is David Glenn from the Poop Sheet. I'm just not doing it, Now, some people say that means I have a chip on my shoulder. I don't know. I think it's a little bit more common sense. If I'm going to dive into something, it has to be something that I'm proud of. Mm-hmm. And if I'm leaving messages for the commissioner of the ACC, it's got to be call back. Please call back David Glenn from what became the ACC Sports Journal. So they kind of bent to me, and that is how the Poop Sheet became the ACC Sports Journal and later ACCSports.com.
I feel like this is a very important part of the conversation for, it's the point of this podcast being a brief history of Triangle Sports. What was the ACC Poop Sheet?
The Poop Sheet was a newsletter. So picture like the old Xerox machines. It was not yet a magazine. It was not yet sort of that newsprint style magazine that the ACC Sports Journal became, where it might have been 32 pages or whatever, and it was kind of a fold-out type thing. It was an old-fashioned, like a tri-fold newsletter that was mailed to you if you were a subscriber, but had very limited distribution, unless you could drive it to a place on Hillsborough Street or Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. You were either subscribing by mail or you knew one of the dozen places that somebody might seriously have just put these little newsletters near the cash register, hoping somebody would buy one the way they might grab a pack of baseball cards or some chewing gum or some cigarettes or something. And it was two things. Covering recruiting, mostly basketball recruiting, a little football recruiting. A guy named Brick Ettinger was and to this day has been involved with the Poop Sheet / ACC Sports Journal. And the other part was kind of insider. You can't get this information in your local newspaper, behind-the-scenes type stuff on ACC schools. Those were the two prongs of the Poop Sheet. We kind of amplified both of those prongs and got into other things when we turned it into the ACC Sports Journal. But that magazine still exists today as a glossy. That website still exists today as ACCSports.com. And but those two themes, recruiting and insider type stuff, of course, starting way before the internet was created.
Sure.
That was the sort of the birth of the Poop Sheet, which became the Sports Journal.
The Poop Sheet, basically, you're getting dirt. It's the Poop Sheet. Right. Got it. So what I'm fascinated by is the shift from being clearly you were getting freelancers or established beat writers on the low to give you information. I guess there's this difference of opinion from a news editor for an established newspaper and what is fit to print, so to speak, versus what you kind of know because you're around programs all the time and you want to give that information out, but it's not going to pass the smell test for an editor. So how did those relationships start? How did you inherit those relationships to get people who were established beat writers on the low to give you information they would not put in their actual newspaper?
One quick story because you're documenting history here. Thad Mumal, my predecessor as the editor, told me, because I asked the same question that's probably on most people's minds, how do you get the Poop Sheet? And you're right, it is kind of the dirt, et cetera.
Yeah.
What he told me is that military people of his generation, especially Navy midshipmen, when you go out on the top level of your ship, many military people called that the poop deck. Right. I don't know why.
Yeah, I've never understood why.
But you'd step up there and you'd kind of shoot the breeze. You'd be, down in the ship. You'd be a military person, and then when you went upstairs, you just kind of shoot the bleep, right? So it became the poop deck, which
Dave,
was
it's a podcast.
Which was that's right. I'm wired differently. So anyway, I found that interesting because I asked the same question way back in the early 1990s, and that was the basic answer. To answer your other question, you have to remember that there was no internet yet. So we were a long way away from sports editors of traditional newspapers and what became their websites at some point in the later 1990s. Today, people are pounding their writers to get into more and more recruiting.
Got to tweet it out.
Back then, most sports editors frowned upon recruiting coverage. They rolled their eyes at it as if it were beneath them. Seriously, some of them held it in disdain. Like that's what the poop sheet does, not what a professional newspaper does.
But why? Because if a sports editor understood the importance of sports in North Carolina, I mean, we understand that Tobacco Road is what it is. I mean, anybody listening to this podcast understands the dynamics of why sports matters in North Carolina, especially when it comes to basketball, especially in the 70s and the 80s when that was peak ACC time. Why did sports editors not extend that fervor for sports down to, well, clearly they want to know who the guys are going to play at these schools?
Yeah, part of it was pre-internet, there's only so much space.
Okay.
So we have to decide what is worth our space.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not 1,000 places to get game coverage. There's not 1,000 places the way there is today to get a preview of the next game or a really good in-depth feature story or whatever. So it was a matter of priority, and not everybody was the same. I remember I worked part-time at the Durham Herald-Sun from the late 80s to the late 90s, and I remember having these conversations like, I'm making a lot of money over what became the ACC Sports Journal based on people ringing our phone off the hook between our print publications. Half of our phone calls were, I read this, and there was no internet yet, remember, and they want to know what's happening, and they don't want to wait for our next magazine, so they're calling us every day. That was 50% of our phone calls. Meanwhile, at the Herald-Sun, I could tell that when word came out that so-and-so, Danny Ferry, way back in the day, was being recruited by Duke and Carolina, and nobody was sure where he was going to go. And he was kind of famous because he was a prep All-American, and his dad was an NBA executive, and he went to DeMatha High School and played for Morgan Wooten, so it was a very high-profile thing. And the phone's ringing off the hook at the Durham Herald-Sun. Mm-hmm. Now, it got to the point where they would write a 5-paragraph summary. Danny Ferry, after visiting schools A, B, C, and D, has chosen to play for Mike Krzyzewski at Duke. But it had not gotten to the point where they were elaborating a lot more on that. So these beat writers did not have an outlet with their main paycheck.
With the traditional paper, yeah.
They didn't have an outlet for the elaborate recruiting stuff, for the most part. And then they definitely didn't have an outlet for, I heard this behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. Because a professional newspaper, and I've worked for them, I know what the standard is. It's not, I heard this, or behind these two players don't get along.
Sure.
Or these coaches think this player is a wuss. And they're just not – people are wondering why he's not getting playing time. He's not getting playing time because behind the scenes, his coaches are calling him a big bleep.
Yeah.
And so we would be able to write about those things. And it will not surprise you, given your long time in the media, when I took over as the editor of and forced the name change, ACC Sports Journal, the poop sheet, best to my knowledge, had never been accredited to cover anything.
I remember.
And to say that I inherited a lot of bad relationships would be the understatement of my career.
So the schools clearly were not happy that this information was getting out, and they wouldn't blame the. Clearly, the source of this information came from, as you know, the old horror movie. It's coming from within the building.
Yes.
You just happened to be the one that was corralling it. You were aggregating it.
Yes.
For lack of a better, if we use a modern terminology, you were aggregating this, so you got blamed for this information getting out, not the people who were actually telling you this information.
That's correct.
I guess they couldn't prove it, right?
And I had to be one. The other thing I demanded, besides the name change, was I want my byline on our roundup, that aggregate you were talking about. So if there was this insider section and I took the best stuff that my Georgia Tech person sent me and the best stuff that my Wolfpack person sent me, and then I had my own stuff, I was probably writing 50% of these insider things at some point. Mm-hmm. It would be David, Glenn, and staff.
Gotcha.
And my pitch to the various schools, or even the Atlantic Coast Conference when it came time to accrediting somebody for the ACC tournament, my pitch was, you all used to complain about not knowing who wrote what, or the bigger complaint was, we're not sure whom to call if we have a complaint or a question.
Sure.
And when I got there, I said, listen, here I am. Call me.
Yeah.
I will answer any question from any coach, any administrator, but I also would like to be accredited to these games. And gradually, that worked out. But yeah, it was revolutionary for the time. There were other publications that covered football recruiting or basketball recruiting, but there was no long-term successful publication that covered a single conference the way that we did.
Yeah.
7, 8, now 15 schools. And, we've had 40 years or more of staying power in a way that others did not. But it was not without some serious growing pains and causing a lot of angst in the schools that we covered.
Now, you and I have known each other for a very long time because when I came out of NC State and graduated in 2001, I was working part-time at 850 The Buzz, and you were doing Saturday 1-hour segments with our old colleague Chris Clark. And the one thing that I was flabbergasted by when I got started out was because of your coverage and the schools not liking it and the conference clearly not liking it, they wouldn't let you go to the ACC tournament?
That's correct. Eventually that did change, in part because I basically just put myself up for any conversation. And I know that little by little they could see that I was writing really good articles.
Sure.
There's a handful of deeper dive topics that, for example, David Teal in Virginia would tackle, ACC financial stuff.
Sure.
Or stuff that you need Freedom of Information Act requests. They could see that I was doing some serious journalism, and I'm not just some real estate agent, masquerading as a sports writer. I graduated from the #1 journalism school in the country, so they knew I was an actual journalist.
Right.
They knew I was doing actual journalism, and then, really importantly, I was putting my name on everything that I wrote. So there was no more, we're not sure whom to call. There was no more,
But
we're
Dave,
not
you
sure
would sneak into the
we're
tournament.
to complain. I would. I did sneak into the tournament.
So
I was
but
actually.
it's not like
I was actually once.
right?
I was actually escorted out of the ACC tournament by security one time.
Whose call was that? Was that Swafford's call?
I don't think so. Well, the funny thing was, I was going to the ACC tournament in, let's just say, a creative, perhaps slightly underhanded fashion.
Okay.
For a while, I thought it was ridiculous that. Truly, at one point, I became one of the leading journalists on the Atlantic Coast Conference,
Sure.
period. Just objectively speaking, that was true, and they knew that was true. And yet, schools were accrediting us, or me, and the ACC tournament would not. So I just figured out a creative way to get into the ACC tournament, and I did this for a period of, I must have been there for 10 years. And then 1 year, somebody asked to see the name on my badge, and I remember to this day, Greg Doyle, now in Indianapolis, was sitting next to me, and he's like, "DG, what is going on?" And I just said,
What was the name on the credential?
I can't say that without.
But it was somebody else's name?
It was an actual person.
Okay.
It was an actual person who was also disgusted by how I was treated.
Gotcha.
And was part of the creative scheme.
Okay, statute of limitations, man. The lawyer should know. You can't get in trouble for saying who it is now.
Yeah. It was one of the people involved still works in the sports media.
Gotcha.
And I don't think I would be doing him a favor.
All right.
But there were others involved that.
So what was the reason for kicking you out of the tournament?
Technically, it was because I could not prove that I was the person whose name was on the badge I was wearing around my neck, which was true. I was
technically true.
I actually said I left all my identification at the hotel. But the funny thing was, all these sports information directors, as we used to call them, all these athletic directors, for a period of 10 years, they'd come up and talk to me.
Sure.
Like the referees would come up and talk to me.
Sure.
Everybody knew who I was, but it was somewhere in the midst of it all, they realized how I'd been getting in every year, did not like that. And then, of course, we worked it out so that I was actually getting in as David Glenn of the ACC Sports Journal. But it was a long and painful road.
Was there anything as an editor that you would get from somebody that you refused to publish?
Yeah, my legal background helped there. I
Okay.
mean, the first barrier is, could this get us sued
Yeah.
if it is incorrect in any way? So that contributor would have to satisfy my bar.
Even if it was just, I'm hearing ... It's informed speculation.
Yeah,
You still had to cover your bases.
I'm kind of wired in a way that I'm about fairness. Like, I take no joy in exaggeration. To me, if there are real world chemistry issues in the locker room,
Sure.
I'm not going to apologize for one of my people reporting that.
This gets to Matt Doherty.
Matt Doherty's departure was not about wins and losses, and it certainly did not stem from NCAA violations. It was, in the words of Athletic Director Dick Bedore, unique.
It would be an unqualified mistake to say the resignation was the result of only their concerns and questions. It is undeniable that there have been some turmoil regarding the status of players in the program for some time.
Bedore says Doherty, by resigning, put the university's interest ahead of his own. Chancellor James Measer says the basketball coach at Carolina must create a good environment for learning.
The issue here is not basketball. It's not wins and losses or players running the program. It's about leadership. At Carolina, we talk about student athletes and teacher coaches.
Player input played a part in Doherty's mutually agreed to resignation.
I asked them to look into my eyes and accept my confidence, and I would accept their confidence. And that's what I intend to do. I will not talk about those discussions.
Some observers have characterized this as a player revolt. Others have implied that we only started looking into this when the season ended last week. Nothing could be further from the truth.
The administrator said they were concerned about the possibility of player transfers, something which had taken place in the past and which had been widely reported as possible again this season.
That was one of our bigger stories.
That's right. That was for those who might not remember.
That was easier for me, Joe, because I wrote it.
Sure.
In other words, I didn't have to quiz one of my writers. Hey, did you
Sure.
do this? Did you do this? What's your due diligence? Did you?
But you're
give them a
hearing
chance to
wild. And
respond?
I wanted to get to Doherty because I think that's a good example of. I'm guessing because Gilio and I recently did this podcast with Roy Williams, and he actually addressed the Doherty thing in that podcast, and he talked about how a lot of that stuff was overblown, from the Dean Smith office thing to everything else. But I wanted to get to this point in your career arc because you hear all these wild things.
Yeah.
Specific to Doherty, there was some really salacious things that were going on behind the scenes, what people said about Doherty. So did you ever stop in those situations and go, wait a minute, is this for real? Like, can I publish this? Can I talk about this on the radio?
Well, early in the process, yes.
Okay.
But by the time I was writing those articles in the ACC Sports Journal, which actually, seriously, were passed around in meetings of the UNC Board of Trustees. Mm-hmm. I was told by multiple members of the Board of Trustees that essentially they would say, read this article. This is what's going on in the UNC men's basketball program. Our fans are attacking this guy online, and yet he's got it exactly right.
Okay.
And I had the receipts. So I had talked to Matt Doherty's players at Notre Dame. And I'm talking about, Joe, over a period of seriously 12 or more months, I'm building this story. He had only been a head coach for 1 year at Notre Dame. And one of the players I talked to had talked about him crossing some lines of abuse, just verbal abuse and being really personal. Instead of, Joe, get back on defense, it would be, Joe, how many bleeping times do I have to tell your lazy sack of bleep, bleep, bleep? And it just became this, wow, this dude's got anger management issues. And the same guy said nice things like, Matt can be the coolest dude in the room.
Sure.
And Matt can be, the reincarnation of the devil. Mm-hmm. And I just filed that away. And then little by little, I came to understand that, it got to the point where the president of the University of North Carolina, and none of this is rumor. I'm talking to UNC players at the time.
Yeah.
I'm talking to their moms and dads in some cases.
And parents love to talk.
I'm talking to walk-ons in some cases who are out of the spotlight, but maybe somebody told them that I could be trusted and it was okay to tell me what was going on behind the scenes. But it got to the point where high-profile prep All-American basketball players who had loved the fact that they chose UNC and the huge stage of the ACC and the nice hotels and the nice airplanes, not an exaggeration, they had grown to hate basketball.
Yeah.
Not an exaggeration. And it was really personal stuff with somebody like a Sean May. It was really, really personal stuff with multiple players where it got abusive. And some of that other stuff did matter, how you treated the secretaries who were beloved in that community, how you treated the photos on the wall, where you put Coach Dean Smith's office, how you handled Phil Ford, who was not a part of the staff as a beloved former All-American player for the Tar Heels who had been on another staff.
Yeah.
All that other stuff mattered, but it really came down to the point where moms and dads are asking for and getting face-to-face meetings with the president of, not just the athletic director, the president of the university saying, you've got a problem, and if you don't solve this problem, our son's not playing for the Tar Heels next year.
Okay.
And because I was talking to people in the room, my sources were not secondhand sources. That always makes me nervous. These are players, moms and dads, former Notre Dame players, coaches in the program and around the league.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt had a problem, and he's admitted some of his problems, but I don't think people will ever understand the level of dysfunction and absolute mutiny that were going on in UNC basketball at the time.
I use Matt Doherty and that time and the disintegration of his tenure at North Carolina to get to the recruiting side of things, because as you said, you're talking to firsthand people, not secondhand information, and you can write all these things out. You have it backed up. With recruiting, there's always accusations in the area that, wait a minute, we had this guy, and then suddenly he flipped. What happened?
Yeah, right.
And if you are getting all of this information, I'm assuming that you've also received a lot of accusations from assistant coaches, guys who are working those recruits, the people who are covering these schools and working these recruiting stories. They know how a guy might have flipped that might be an NCAA violation. Have you ever decided, you know there's something that's an NCAA violation going on, but you don't report it, you don't talk about it, you file it away? Because we always hear stories all the time about how XYZ happens or how this recruit ended up going to this school because there was something going on behind the scenes. So how did you handle that when you would hear some wild stories and decide, you know what, I'll file it away but not report it?
Yeah, when I just heard something, all I could do was file it away.
Okay.
I wasn't going to report just because I heard a rumor. One thing I did in the 1990s was hire a guy named Dave Tellep, who's now, I think he's the assistant general manager of the San Antonio Spurs.
Been for
NBA.
a long time, yeah.
But he covered recruiting for ESPN.com and Rivals.com and Scout.com. And, of course, we gave him his first job, not only with the ACC Sports Journal, but we had a recruiting website called PrepStars.com. I didn't own that the way I did the Sports Journal, but I helped run it for a while. So Dave would be in those trenches in a way I was not.
Okay.
So he'd be talking to the players and the moms and the dads and the coaches and the assistant coaches, and he would know that some story that was just told violated like 5 NCAA rules.
We all know about the bag man. We all talk about the bag man.
But because PrepStars.com, the editorial mission was simply, who are the top players? What are they saying about their favorite schools? It was not Dave Tellep's job to get into the dirty side of things, right? And he is one of the nicest people you'll ever meet, and it's not really in his nature to sort of get into that stuff. So he would file it away while writing about just sort of the more, this is how good this guy is, these are his 5 favorite schools, his coach and his dad are the key people in his recruitment, these are his favorite assistant coaches at these various ACC schools. So, yeah, you'd hear a lot, but I was kind of a secondary person. Brick Ettinger and Dave Tellep would do our basketball recruiting, and I would edit their stuff.
Okay.
And I would go to the Bob Gibbons tournament or the Myrtle Beach tournament. I would go to some of these things, the NBA Players Association camp in Charlottesville. So I was half editor, half writer, I guess, on recruiting.
What I'm getting at here, Dave, is where the bodies are buried.
Yeah.
On some of these recruiting stories.
I guess, but that's where my legal training comes in. How many of them could I prove to you were true?
I wanted to bring this up because people get mad at the media when an NCAA story happens, right? You could talk about the North Carolina scandal or what happened with Dennis Smith Jr. at NC State. And what ends up happening all the time is that a lot of us on this side go, yeah, not surprised.
Yeah.
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We'd heard things. I think it's important for the consumer, the fan, to understand we can hear a lot of different things, but proving it is another matter altogether, right?
It's very hard.
Yeah.
I mean, in some cases, there's a famous Kentucky basketball story where literally they mailed cash to a recruit.
Right.
And that cash was found. Now, that's some real good hard evidence. And I'm not I don't need to call my attorney of counsel to see if it's okay to print this article. That's a pretty straightforward one. But I'll tell you a real quick funny story. Coach K and Dean Smith were not quite as cozy as, say, Kay and Jim Valvano had become, or how more recently Roy Williams and Mike Krzyzewski do have a truly a relationship of mutual respect. That's not an act. Kay and Dean were a little bit more complicated. And in the late 80s and early 90s, they were both recruiting hard a guy like Danny Ferry. They were both recruiting hard a guy like Christian Leitner, Grant Hill, et cetera. All three of those guys, of course, ended up with the Blue Devils, and then the Devils win back-to-back national titles. There are stories that I know to be true where Kay or Dean would hear that when the Tar Heels were entertaining a recruit on an official visit or the Blue Devils had a recruit on an official visit, there are rules, Joe, and some of them have been changed, but if I want to take you to a certain restaurant, the rules at the time said it couldn't be more than X miles from campus. Sure. Okay? And, there's the famous weird rule where, you can have a bagel, but you can't have cream cheese with it.
Jim Larinaga made that one famous.
Some of these have been changed, fortunately. But there are famous phone calls that I believe happened where essentially Kay would call Dean or Dean would call Kay. And, well, Mike, I was told that when you were hosting so-and-so, y'all did this, which is against – maybe you didn't know that was going to happen, but your players did take them there, and that's an NCAA violation. And Kay would say, well, Dean, now that you've brought that up, someone told me that when you were hosting player so-and-so, you may not know this, but ask your staff, y'all took them here, and that's an NCAA violation. And the way the story was told to me, Dean Smith was a big golfer. Their conversation essentially ended like if you and I were playing golf, good. We both have two foot putts, and you don't want to have to hit it out.
Sure.
Good, Joe. And you say, good, DG. Kay and Dean, based on recruiting violations, instead of calling the NCAA compliance office, would have the good.
All right.
And that's how most of those things go. And as you know, it is only the rare case. Reggie Bush at Southern Cal. There was evidence related to a lawsuit that made a lot of, unsavory details become public information in a way that makes it evidence, in a way that makes it easier to write about and talk about without getting sued. 9 times out of 10, you just don't have people willing to talk on the record, and that makes it a lot harder.
Now, about that basketball recruiting, and I guess there's a specific time frame that's related to when you were deep in the coverage of ACC recruiting. I am curious what the most impactful basketball players were. And we'll keep it to the big four. We'll talk about Duke, Carolina, NC State, and Wake Forest. I think most people understand with one-and-done recruiting now, things are a little bit different. But there are key recruits during this time frame that can change trajectories of programs.
For sure.
So I am curious, in your coverage during that time, which one of those players for each school would you consider the most impactful for the program and helped kind of shape where those programs went during that time?
I'll spit out some names, and then we can elaborate however much or little you want to.
Okay.
Tim Duncan of Wake Forest is one of the greatest recruiting stories in the history of recruiting stories, right? The swimmer from the Virgin Islands, whose only other official visit was to Delaware State University. And he ends up...
Delaware State?
Correct. Not Delaware. Delaware State.
Oh.
That was his only other official visit.
All right.
And he ends up being one of the...
huge miss by the Blue Hens, man.
One of the greatest players of all time after being... an afterthought who was a swimmer in the Virgin Islands. I think Julius Hodge at NC State was hugely important for the Wolfpack. That was right after the turn of the century. And my other examples would come from my earlier time covering recruiting. If you want to go far back, Johnny Dawkins is the most important Mike Krzyzewski recruit ever. Now, I'm not old enough that I covered Johnny Dawkins recruiting.
Yeah.
Later in the 80s, I do think Danny Ferry where Coach K beat Dean Smith head-to-head on a recruit, which was rare, kind of started the wave going in the Blue Devils' direction. They had not yet won any national titles yet for Coach K.
Right.
And they signed Danny Ferry over Carolina in the late 80s. That was really big. So either Dawkins or Ferry for Duke. And then in Carolina's case, I remember I was living and breathing right in the middle of all this. There was a class led by Eric Montross where you could feel for the first time that Duke under Coach K was kind of pulling just imagine a tug of war.
Yeah.
Dean Smith had been winning tugs of war against everybody since the 1960s. In the late 80s, and Duke went to the national title game in 1986, in the late 80s, you could feel that Coach K was starting to win the tug of war a little bit. Not only in recruiting, sometimes on the court, and then, of course, he wins back-to-back national titles in 91 and 92. Right in the midst of all that, after Duke beat Carolina for Danny Ferry, as Duke is beating Carolina for Christian Laettner, who becomes one of the greatest players in college basketball history, Dean Smith had a fire lit under him on the recruiting trail, which was not his favorite thing to do.
Yeah, he famously did not like doing that.
No. He signed a class where all 5 signees were parade All-Americans.
Okay.
And 4 of the 5 played in the McDonald's All-American game. So it was Eric Montross at center, a guy named Clifford Rozier who ended up transferring at power forward, Derek Phelps at point guard, Brian Reese on the wing. Those 4 guys played in the McDonald's All-American game. That's a big deal, 4 guys going to one school.
Yeah.
And Pat Sullivan was also a parade All-American, although he was not a McDonald's All-American. So Dean Smith signs this 5-man star-studded class at the beginning of the 1990s, and then by 1993, as people are second-guessing Dean Smith, well, now K has 2 titles, and the only one you have is with that Michael Jordan guy with James Worthy on one side and Sam Perkins on the other side. Like, who couldn't have won that one, right? And that was the conversation at the beginning of the 1990s to a degree. So Dean puts together this recruiting class, and, of course, by 1993, I think those 4 guys, Montross, Reese, Phelps, and Sullivan, were 4 of the top 6 scorers on the 1993 team that Dean Smith takes to the national title. So, those are some of the big names, but they're all great stories.
No, the Tim Duncan one is amusing because, look, Wake Forest has a unique place in basketball history here on Tobacco Road. And I hope Steve Forbes, as of this recording, Steve Forbes hasn't left for another school yet. I know those Maryland rumors, but I hope Steve Forbes gets Wake Forest back to being part of the program, so to speak. But how does Dave Odom, head coach at the time of Wake Forest, stumble into a swimmer who ends up being not just one of the great basketball players that we've ever seen in college, but an all-time NBA legend? How does that happen?
It is one of the greatest recruiting stories in the history of recruiting. And it starts with this. You might remember a really good Wake Forest player named Chris King. Chris King was with a group of NBA draft picks just on an international exhibition tour. So you show up, you're spreading the word of the NBA, you're a young player, maybe you're seeing parts of the world that you haven't seen before. One of their stops is the Virgin Islands. Okay. This 6'9", less than 200-pound dude, which in the Virgin Islands, that's going to stand out on a basketball court. He's most famous for being a really good swimmer, and he's just kind of tooling around with this basketball thing.
Yeah.
Chris King gets back. Dave Odom says, "Did you see anybody on your international tour that was anybody interesting?" And he said, "Coach, this is going to sound crazy, but in the Virgin Islands, I saw somebody." And Coach Odom's like, "I've never, ever heard anybody say those words. I saw a basketball prospect in the Virgin Islands." And he said, "I know, but I really think you might want to look at this kid. He's raw, but we played pickup with him, and there were times that he really blended in." And, that it goes on to, the famous ending is that He did have multiple scholarship offers. I think Hartford was one, Providence was one, Delaware State University.
That still blows my mind.
And Wake Forest.
Yeah.
I believe they were his 4 Division I scholarship offers, but the only 2 that were serious enough about him to get him to officially visit campus were Wake and Delaware State.
Mm-hmm.
And as the story goes, Randolph Childress was already at Wake at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And on one of his visits, they just play some pickup ball.
Mm-hmm.
And the Wake Forest coaches had said about Tim Duncan, we think we might have to redshirt him his first year.
Yeah.
Childress comes back from playing pickup ball and says, guys, you might want to rethink that redshirting the big fella. And, of course, the rest is history. But it was such an unusual story. And, you know, Joe, we had recruiting rankings from 1 to 300. Like
where was Wake at that point with Tim Duncan? Because it's like not like you know what Tim Duncan's going to be at that point.
He was off all
off your
radar.
It's like we talked to John Manuel, who's out there.
Where do you see guys at high school games,
right,
and at all-star tournaments?
Like John Manuel, who was the editor of Baseball America, we asked him like, well, where are you ranking Russell Wilson? You know,
right.
as whatever. He's like, he's not even making our list. You know, like that kind of stuff. And of course, you know, this guy goes on to become a legend. So Tim Duncan's in the same boat.
We got to the point where we basically said our rankings exclude international players.
Okay.
Because how do we know some guy in Manu Ginobili, or in Argentina, or Tony Parker in France? We never seen these guys, so they were not in our rankings, and that was kind of our bailout. Yeah, we missed Tim Duncan too, but
everybody, right?
He's not continental United States.
I feel like there's been so much said about Duke, and there's been so much said about Carolina, especially with the impending retirement of Mike Krzyzewski and obviously Roy Williams having already retired, that I feel like there's a gap in NC State history that I think is important, not just for area sports, but how sports is covered, which gets us back to the poop sheet part of this conversation, not recruiting, but rumors. So it didn't work out for Herb Sendek at NC State. Despite the fact that Julius Hodge class that also included Ilya Evtimov and others was probably the last consistent success that NC State has had in basketball. So Herb Sendek leaves for the desert. He goes to Arizona State. He's fed up with how he's being treated here, so he got out. I have made the argument that NC State basketball coaching search that wound up being Sidney Lowe after so many coaches were talked to and ultimately said no, or people got cheap, like what happened with John Beilein, who was the head coach of West Virginia at the time in terms of buyouts. I am convinced that coaching search gave birth to the modern coaching search and how we cover it. Because at that time,
it was crazy, man.
Message boards were at their peak. Blogs were the stand-in for Twitter, as we have now. The internet allowed us to discover things like FlightAware.
Track planes, man.
Where you're tracking Air Hog 1, Wendell Murphy's plane, or whatever it's called, to see where he's going. And my personal favorite, and this is what I wanted to bring it up to, John Calipari making it to town. Yep. And I know you have details about this. And I've actually considered doing an entire podcast series about this search. I've called it like this the Lee Fowler 6.
I'd have to go back to my notes for that.
I know. So we're going to have to kind of spitball here. But
once we got past Calipari and Barnes, and at that point in time we started hearing other names, and the thought process had to be, why not a state guy?
NC State's former players began lobbying for Sidney Lowe. In the early stages, Lowe was merely a consultant for the search process. Longtime State fans remember a winning player and a winning smile.
I distinctly remember how extremely online this search was. And when you think about it, it really was the proto-coaching search for how things operate today. People figured out, wait a minute, RBC Center at the time, PNC Arena, they've got this webcam that's on 24/7 because it's the internet. It's cool, right? And somebody decided, well, I heard John Calipari's in town, Memphis coach at the time, and that he's doing a tour. And somebody decided, well, there's one way to find out. Let's go to the RBC Center website and look at their webcam.
That's evidence, baby.
And sure enough, the lights turn on. The freaking lights turn on at like midnight or whatever it was. It was late at night. And you see, and it's grainy streaming footage at that time. He didn't have, 4K footage at that time streaming. You see grainy bodies, walking around the floor as Calipari is getting this tour. And, he ends up doing that. So you're hearing this, obviously, about him being in town. I think there's a Dunkin' Donuts aspect.
I think you're right.
I think they went to Dunkin' Donuts, if I remember you telling that story correctly. So I bounced this off of you. Was that coaching search and how it was covered and how you were hearing things were going at NC State? Did that really kind of give birth to the modern coaching search and how we cover things now?
I can go along with that argument.
Okay.
The best that I know, I cover the ACC very intensely. I don't know the rest of the country and their dynamics quite as well. But that was a circus. Mm-hmm. It was a fun circus. It was a complicated circus. It was hard to separate fact from fiction. But one of the valuable parts of my whole PrepStars.com staff, even though they weren't technically contributing to the ACC Sports Journal, they knew everything.
Yeah.
They knew head coaches. They knew assistant coaches. All sorts of crazy stuff is happening. I remember a couple times covering that search where somebody I was talking to didn't realize that they hadn't hung up with me and were using a separate phone to call somebody else. And I could hear them. And I mean, talk about a test of your moral fiber.
Wow.
Like, should I hang up? I don't know.
All
this
right.
is kind of interesting.
Right.
Hey, man, I just got off the phone with DG, and he says that the Wolfpack search is standing here. And I'm talking to someone that I believe was a candidate and knew he was a candidate but wasn't sure where he was in the pecking order. Mm-hmm. So he's calling me to find out where he is in the Wolfpack's pecking order. And that was probably the craziest coaching search that I have ever covered at any school, men's basketball, football, or otherwise. It was unforgettable. And, of course, it had a very unpleasant ending for the Wolfpack because that was one of the more inappropriate hires in the history of ACC sports.
Yeah, it didn't work out in the end. Okay.
But Hodge was a happy story because there had been a 12-year period where the Wolfpack only went to one NCAA tournament. After all that success with Jim Valvano and great signees like Chris Corciani and Rodney Monroe were not like little-known recruits.
Gilio and I talk about how there is such a gap in ACC history. I don't think people understand how freaking good Chris Corciani was or Rodney Monroe was. But, in terms of assists per night, who does that?
What had been weird was in the 70s, the Wolfpack had the cachet to sign guys like David Thompson and Tommy Burleson, and they win a national title with two homegrown players, among others. Even through the 80s, they're still getting guys like Corciani and Monroe. From the very end of the Jim Valvano era all the way through Les Robinson and through those first 5 years of the Herb Sendek era, I believe it was one NCAA trip in 12 years, which is a drought, and very little buzz on the recruiting trail. Like, there just weren't many examples where the Pack got their primary targets. And then this McDonald's All-American from the Bronx, New York, somehow his big, bubbly personality meshes with Carnegie Mellon product Herb Sendek.
Yeah.
It put the Pack back on the map, saying, wow, I guess they still can get the players that Jim Boeheim of Syracuse desperately wanted.
Yes,
he got
did.
a lot of New York City players, Hodge from the Bronx and St. Raymond's High School. And Wolfpack beats Syracuse for New York City kid. That's a freaking headline. And, of course, the Pack ends up going to, 5 straight NCAA tournaments.
You've got the ACC Sports Journal. You're dabbling with us in radio on 850 The Buzz. I know you'd also filled in on things like Sportsline and whatnot. So what made you decide, you know what, I want to do sports radio?
That's a great question. I remember Brian Maloney, who's still, part of...
He's our general manager here at Capital Broadcasting.
I remember him and others saying, have you ever thought of doing sports radio on a bigger scale? And I was just dumb and young enough to say, not really.
Okay.
And I said, I think what led to the Saturday Once a Week show was, hey, man, I'm a practicing attorney. I had not given that up. I didn't yet own the ACC Sports Journal, but I was the editor and the lead writer, which took a lot out of me.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, I just finally got these puzzle pieces into place. I'm not ready to just jump into sports radio. The reason they even asked the question is because I had a lot of fun being a guest on the early versions of sports radio in the Triangle and in other parts of the ACC. And as you know, at least it's my opinion, it's 1,000 times easier to be the guest than to be the host.
Yes.
Like if you
it's also easier to do it once a week.
I think the shyest person in the world, some people are afraid of microphones. If you just keep tossing them questions in their area of expertise, I mean, most people are going to be comfortable with that.
For those who might not remember this time frame, because again, I was screening phone calls in those early days. That hour went by. This is a classic radioism.
Zipped.
An hour is an hour in conceptual time, but there is such a thing as a fast hour of radio.
Doubt.
And when you have all lines on the phone bank filled up with people asking you questions, it's basically teeing it up, answer your questions. It's your wheelhouse, and it was an in-and-out hour. It was a lot of fun to do, a very informative hour. I learned a ton of stuff screening phone calls during that time about how the ACC worked. It was a good because, again, I grew up in South Florida. I had no real connection to the ACC at that time. And I learned a lot, obviously, when I went to NC State, but a real baptism by fire of these guys. I want to talk to Dave about this recruit that I saw at the Gibbons tournament. I'm like, okay, cool, whatever, and put him on. So it is, you're right in that it's easy to do an hour of radio when you're set up. It's easy to do a couple of hours of radio when you're just doing it once a week. But you said, let's do this 5 days a week.
My point was, if we try the Saturday show, I'll find out if I'm any good at it.
Sure.
I might not be.
Sure.
Again, massive change from even being the host of a 1-hour show, much less something bigger. And B, I won't mess up your business model if I fall on my face, right? If you plug me into a role much bigger and I'm horrible, I would feel bad.
Sure.
Whereas a Saturday morning experiment, what's the worst that could happen?
Right.
And over time, and I emphasize to my students all the time, I was not a great sports radio host when I first tried it. In fact, I remember Brian Maloney coming in, I believe, after my first ever segment on the old 850 The Buzz. And he didn't want to deflate me, but he just said one word, DG. And I'm like, what? He goes, breathe.
Yes.
And it was great advice. Breathe, man. I was so excited to answer the people's questions. I was so excited. I had prepared these huge legal pads of notes. I just was so excited to share my information that I was talking so quickly. Maybe I was trying to jam it all into an hour or whatever it was.
Yeah. But you don't realize how much time you actually have.
You don't.
I mean, the first time I actually ever hosted a show was 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday because I ended up doing a 2-hour shift. Shout out to Gordon Miller. But the first time I actually had to do it solo, I'd scripted everything out. I had pages that I'd scripted out. And I mean, now I've been doing this for so long, I just make I basically make little bullet points.
Yep.
Talk about this, not scripting it out kind of because you're comfortable now behind a mic. I don't know anything different. I read 3 or 4 pages of these notes and I looked at the clock. It had been 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I still have 6 more minutes to fill. What the hell do you do? So, yeah, I understand that.
I remember
you have to chill.
I remember those light bulb moments.
But you get comfortable behind the microphone. You start to show your personality. You start doing this a little bit more.
And after the Saturday morning show did well, things outside of my control changed, and they needed a full-time person during the week. And by that point, I was better. That's right. That's right. Don Imus happened. I was better at it. I was more confident with it. I was able to shift some career things around. So it was just a better marriage.
Yeah.
And so it worked out. But I tell my students all the time, be ready to pivot. Add as many tools to your toolbox as you can.
Yes.
I was trained as a writer. Did I dabble in some, college-level radio? Yeah, but I didn't take it seriously the way I took the student newspaper seriously. I grew up in a newspaper world where I thought my life was going to be in newspapers.
But you're a Philly guy with Philly sensibilities doing sports talk in this market. They are not the same sensibilities, Dave.
No. I learned that quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where I had to go into radio with I think I'm pretty good at knowing what I do know, but having my eyes and ears open to what I don't know.
Sure.
And I tried to ask as many questions as I could about the nature of radio, some of which was not common sense to me.
Yeah.
Again, I hadn't been trained in it. I hadn't studied it. I was just having fun with it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to learn, and there's just really smart bullet points about what's the nature of your audience and trying to expand the conversation and trying to share some of your personality, but still making it more about the content than about you.
Also, taste changed too. You know, when we were doing 850 The Buzz, we had things like Buzz Babes.
Yes.
And we had calendars with Buzz Babes and risque commercials with Buzz Babes having sprinklers come on on a golf course.
I can't honestly say I don't miss those days, Joe.
Well, that's the thing.
That's a politically incorrect thing to say, but I cannot tell a lie.
That you don't miss those days? Or you miss those days?
I do miss those days, which I'm not supposed to say.
No. But here's the thing, though. I do and I don't. Because I also think there's an evolution of like when these things were happening, I was in my mid-20s, man. When you're in your mid-20s, that kind of stuff, being a little bit crass, all that stuff makes sense. Then you get older. You live a life. You have kids. And you start to go, oh, man, that was kind of embarrassing. And like the same way you would do with stuff that you did in high school. And I also think, too, that the audience also evolves over time and what is acceptable and what isn't changes. But that's specific to sports radio. We'll close on this.
By the way, your point about Philly is well taken, because if I had tried to talk all pro sports in a market like North Carolina, whereas if I had tried to talk all college sports up in my hometown of Philly, they'd have fired me at the end of the first day.
But that's part of the evolution.
Yes.
As this
we're a great state now. I mean, we are the perfect blend of college and pro.
I would argue that doing sports talk radio in the Triangle is actually the most dynamic place you could ever do sports radio.
I would not argue with that.
Because you have so many transplants in this area who've come here for work or a variety of reasons that I can sit here and talk about the NFL intelligently with a whole audience who's interested in all sorts of stuff. Like Gilio and I gave away, Buffalo-based beer. Like there are so many Buffalo people in this area or connections to Buffalo that when the Bills lost, the audience felt it in this market. That we gave away Labatt and Jenny Cream Ale. So just like, hey, drink your sorrows away. So I would argue this area is unique versus other markets, and we can talk more pro sports now than we did 20 years ago. But I also feel, too, that there's been an evolution in how the colleges are discussed. I felt that things were more objective back when I started doing radio.
Totally agree.
And somewhere along the lines, the websites that cover the schools don't cover them objectively, or there's varying degrees of objectivity. Like, to be fair, I will give Inside Carolina a lot of credit because Greg Barnes will take a coaching staff to task. He will point out what's going wrong with the school rather than trying to massage a story that doesn't upset the coaching staff, because these websites almost feel like extensions of the schools now rather than coverage. And maybe you see it, maybe you don't, but I feel like recruiting coverage has become more of these sites trying to help sell the school and have fans be on board rather than objectively telling you, here's what's going on with recruits or the school. Is that a fair observation?
I'm with you on this. And for about a 20-plus year period from 1994 until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I made every hiring decision for a writer for the ACC Sports Journal, ACCSports.com. And my number one requirement was a willingness to take off your fan glasses if you have them. Whatever's churning in your stomach or your heart, I don't care. You can secretly and quietly and privately hope this team wins or that team loses, or you like this coach, you hate that coach.
Right.
I don't care what's going on in your heart. But what has to come out in your writing is fairness and objectivity and not fanboyism or fangirlism. And I agree with you. There are definitely positive exceptions to the rule that you're talking about. But it's gotten to the point where it's, I'd say, almost half of questions at fairly high-profile press conferences are embarrassingly bad.
We've actually had,
and the cheerleading from websites about the school they cover, to me, is embarrassingly bad. Now, if they admit that that's what they are, then it's up to the consumer whether they want to consume that or not.
Sure.
It's the people who believe they're journalists who are really masquerading fanboys. They're the ones that I don't have any respect for. But there's a market for what they do and how they do it.
To be completely candid, we've had some friction. Gilio and I specifically have had some friction with, say, NC State. And there is an attitude that is, I guess, I guess NC State they'll go on the recruiting trail and they'll go to an SEC market, and I'll use Mississippi State as an example, and they'll go there and they're like, man, like everybody there who's covering Mississippi State rides for Mississippi State.
Root for the home team.
And they view it as, well, if they're good, then things will be good for us, and everybody wins. All the rising tide lifts all ships, right? Whereas here we have multiple demographics to, we got Carolina fans who listen, we have Duke fans who listen, we have, because it's a unique ACC market, we have Virginia Tech fans that listen. You know this. And I feel like there's a failure to understand that you have, specific to NC State, you have plenty of people who cover you in the way that you want to be covered.
True.
Why do you care if we do what we do?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on a version of a conversation that I've been having, usually with people that I respect, sometimes a coach, sometimes an athletic director, sometimes even a university president, where I have had to say, bottom line, I don't care how other people do things. I don't. David, 90% of the people who cover us say nothing but positive things.
That sounds familiar.
With all due respect, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Part 2, I'm not on your team. It is not my goal to make you the coach, you the player, you the mom or dad of the player, you the president of the university. It is not my goal to make you happy.
Yeah.
I am not a kitten that you leave a bowl of milk out for and tell me how much I'm allowed to lap up. Now, I do want to be respectful. Yes. I am absolutely going to be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to bend over backwards to be fair. So when you call me, and I encourage you to call me, I would say all the time, number one, if something's accurate, I will apologize, correct it immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Inaccurate if it's inaccurate. That did not happen very often. Usually it was part 2. If something's unfair, that's a little bit of a longer conversation.
That's nebulous.
Than it's inaccurate. But I'm willing to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll listen to you, and then I expect you to listen to me. And if it was unfair, I'll figure out a way to be better, or I'll figure out a way to correct it. I really believe that among fans, fan is short for fanatic, you don't get as much reasonableness among fans. Not all fans. Many fans are very reasonable. But fanatics tend to be a little unreasonable toward truths that they don't like to hear or they don't want to believe, even if you have a mountain of evidence backing it up. Among administrators and coaches and people of authority, in my experience, at least 80% are pretty reasonable toward the media, but they don't have a lot of practice at pushback.
Yeah,
they really don't.
It is a foreign concept now.
They know that they have the bully pulpit. They know younger journalists are not going to push back for the most part.
Yeah,
I was a business owner and an attorney and a trained journalist, so they were going to get pushback from me 100% of the time.
And for me, I've been doing this too damn long. Like, what are you going to tell me?
Right? And it's just let's. I remember sports, what we used to call sports information directors.
Yeah, they're much flowery language
pounding a young journalist who had reported a coach having some physical stress on the sidelines, and pounding that person because they said it was a HIPAA violation. And saying it with like confidence and with disdain and beating up this young person. And I'm telling you, man, it's a good thing that person didn't come at me that way.
Right.
Because, A, if you don't know what you're talking about, back the hell up. The idea that some HIPAA privacy law, which I understand better than you do, by the way, the idea that it would prevent you or me or anybody else from tweeting or reporting, we just saw a coach have a fainting spell.
What I saw.
That is not stealing his medical records from the local doctor's office. I mean, and yet that's the putting the bowl of milk out.
Yeah.
There are some coaches that need to hear from members of the media. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
There are some ADs and some media relations people who need the occasional pushback. Again, most people, if I'm going to be respectful to you and how you do your job, I'm not going to I'm going to demand that you're respectful to me and how I do my job. I just think you have to come to those conversations with a lot of ammunition and hope the other person has an open mind. But Yes, because of the clown show, fanboy, and fangirlism.
Yes.
Those of us who take our objectivity more seriously and journalistic integrity more seriously, we're viewed as the outliers. And the people in positions of power sometimes want to know why we're not going along with the flock.
You're teaching the youths this now. You're teaching at UNC Wilmington?
I'm having a lot of fun at UNCW. That's a huge, important part of the state for Maria, my wife, and me, the lovely and talented Maria. We got engaged there. We got married there. Mm-hmm. I've been going there as just a goofball surfer boy since the late 1980s. And I'm not even a good surfer, more of a golfer. But, yeah, I love that part of our state.
Yeah.
And I wanted to try a university that really believes in the whether you call it communications or journalism or multimedia, whatever. But I didn't want to leave the state. Mm-hmm. I actually was offered jobs by out-of-state universities, but I just love this state, in part for the reasons you were describing earlier on the sports culture here. So I put out flyers to maybe a half a dozen in-state universities that I like how they do their communications department. And when UNCW bit, I was like, all right.
More reasons to go out to the Wilmington area.
Oh my gosh!
So when you see kids today, I mean, I feel like conditions are not set for people to have long media careers anymore for a variety of reasons. But there's still a hunger there that you see with these kids taking these classes and taking your class. So, what is your overall impression of what this generation is looking for? What brings them to covering sports?
Well, it does start with a love of sports,
mm-hmm.
and many of them will volunteer, especially the younger ones. I'm not really sure what I want to do, but I hope it's something related to sports, which I can identify with. I think at 18 or 19, I didn't have a well-defined view.
Yeah, for me, I just wanted to do radio. I didn't know what kind of radio I wanted to do. I ended up doing this.
You're never sure how the details are going to play out. You're never sure. Heck, man, I thought I might have a writer's career, and I ended up having maybe more of a radio career and some TV sprinkled in and stuff like that. So you never know. But they're thirsty to learn practical things, including we do talk about the changing nature of the sports media industry. Mm-hmm. And just like the newspapers were in a massive decline in the 1990s and early 2000s, and that's bad. Fewer jobs and lower paying jobs. That's not good. But they're not dead either. Yeah. You and I have plenty of friends and colleagues whose main paycheck comes from a newspaper and or its website. So we'll talk about things like, for example, the NFL's most recent TV deal, which goes all the way into, I think it's 2033, so more than a decade into the future, roughly doubled the value of its previous TV deal. It's a $10 billion with a B per year set of TV deals. And it even gets Amazon Prime, a non-traditional partner, involved with their Thursday Night Football package. Well, that is no exaggeration. The strongest economic model in the history of sports. Mm-hmm. The $10 billion a year, and of course you have other revenue streams if you're the National Football League, but you're the wealthiest league in the history of the world, and you're in our country. Mm-hmm. So on one of my first classes every semester, I paint this picture where, long story short, 4 of the 6 most lucrative sports leagues in the history of the world are A, right now, and B, based in our country. Yeah. It's NFL 1, baseball and the NBA kind of flip-flop at 2 and 3, and the NHL is number 6. Mm-hmm. So, some international soccer leagues are elsewhere in the top 10. But there's even other, MLS is growing. We have Charlotte FC launching this year, in our state, for example. NASCAR calls North Carolina home, and it is in decline as a sport. But again, that doesn't mean it's dead. So if you have these successful economic engines, that means jobs. Yeah. So for every sad story, newspapers are in decline. Sports radio as an economic model has been complicated by things like podcasts, has been complicated by things like COVID.
We do a live podcast now. We don't do a radio show.
Good
live podcast.
It's a good way to put it. It's a good. Hey man, we
the 3 hours that we do on the radio, it's all for podcast.
We posted
purposes.
Every hour of my show as a podcast for decades. I think.
Don't get me started. It's the dumbest thing when I hear about a podcast did like 1,000 downloads. If I had 1,000 listeners right now, I'd get fired. Like, come on, right? Now. But that's another story.
It is. But yeah, we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I just tell them whatever the truth is, as I know it, I'm going to answer your questions that way. And there's a lot of bad news in our industry, but there's also a lot of good news in our industry. And if you're willing to just kind of add tools to your toolbox, whether that's verbal communication, how you write, videography, or something else, for every bad example, for every shrinking economic model, there are things like in-house media that are growing. 20 years ago, you couldn't write for the NC State University Athletics official
now
website.
they have an entire media arm.
Yeah, now you have in-house videographers, in-house social media people, in-house writers and editors. So, newspapers are shrinking and these other areas are shrinking, but yet over here, these other areas are growing. So it's a mixed bag, and I've always said if you can figure out where your passions overlap with your talents, ride that wave as long as you possibly can. But you raise a good question because, Joe, I get the question a lot, what do I do with my time nowadays? And there's a whole bunch of things that we don't have time to get into. But one of them is I counsel often people in their late 20s who have loved covering sports for a decade, but maybe their income has not risen as quickly as they thought, and maybe they're either getting married or starting a family and they have to look at money differently.
Yeah.
So the question at the end of their 20s is, am I really going to give up a job that all along I had said was a dream job and I'm getting paid or to write or talk or both about sports?
Yeah.
And that's a hard decision. And then the funniest thing is, not funny haha, but funny quirky, is in people's 50s, it comes all the way around because the corporate side of things realizes, well, you're good and you've got 30 years of experience, but we can hire 2 people for less money than what you're making right now. And so then you might be posed the hypothetical, do you love your job so much that you would do it for 50% of what we're paying you right now? And so I counsel people sort of at that latter part of their career. And both of those questions boil down to how much value do you place on happiness and following your passion and you exercising those talents and bonding with your listeners or readers or whatever, and how much weight do you put on money? And I tell them I don't have that. There is no one-size-fits-all answer.
No.
Everybody has to make those determinations for himself or herself. But those are the real-world things that we talk about in class. And I know the students, I get enough feedback to know that they'll say, this is the most practical class I've had in my 4 years at UNCW. And Mr. Glenn may pound us over the head with too many facts at times, but they do like going from the philosophical and the theoretical to this guy's coming from 35 years in the real world, and he's hitting us with the real world every day.
Dave, I appreciate it, man.
Great to be with you, Joe.
A brief history of Triangle Sports, sponsored by Copiers Plus, your local office equipment and solutions provider. Take the mystery out of your printing expenses by scheduling your free print audit today at copiers-plus.com.